In 1867, the world stood at a fragile intersection between faith and reason, between superstition and the sharp edge of measurable truth. The century had already witnessed upheavals that redefined humanity's understanding of itself. The Industrial Revolution reshaped landscapes with smoke and iron. Railways stitched continents together. Telegraph wires hummed with invisible signals that seemed almost supernatural, yet were explained through equations and disciplined study. Only 8 years earlier, Charles Darwin had published On the Origin of Species, unsettling pulpits and lecture halls alike with the audacity of evolution. By 1867, science was not merely a method, it was becoming an authority, a new kind of doctrine promising that mystery was temporary, that ignorance was a problem to be solved. Universities expanded their laboratories. Physicians began to reject folklore in favor of anatomy and controlled observation. If something existed, it could be tested. If it could be tested, it could be understood. The age of wonder was giving way to the age of explanation. And yet, in a quiet rural settlement far removed from the electric glow of urban innovation, a story began that would quietly defy that confidence. The town was small, the kind of place where mud roads carried carriage wheels and conversations traveled faster than official records. Most families survived on modest trades: farming, carpentry, small mercantile work. Education was practical, often brief. Books were scarce, and higher learning rarer still. It was not a place from which anomalies were expected to emerge. Timothy Caldwell was born into this unremarkable environment. His father, a tradesman of modest means, was known more for diligence than distinction. His mother, quiet and devout, kept careful order in a home that allowed little room for extravagance. There were no tutors, no secret libraries, no access to the intellectual circles flourishing in larger cities. By all accounts, Timothy's beginnings were ordinary. But by the time he reached adolescence, something about him had begun to unsettle those around him. It started subtly, a remark at the dinner table that seemed far too informed for a boy who had never left the county. An accurate description of distant geographical features, mentioned only once in passing by a traveler. Teachers noticed that he absorbed information with unnatural speed. He did not merely memorize, he appeared to internalize, to reconstruct knowledge as though it had been waiting somewhere inside him. In 1867, such claims were not treated lightly. The scientific community had grown cautious of superstition. Any report of extraordinary ability risked being dismissed as exaggeration or religious fervor. Yet what made Timothy's case different was the tone of those who first documented it. They were not preachers or mystics. They were local physicians, men who prided themselves on rational inquiry. One such doctor, whose surviving notes remain unsigned, described Timothy as possessing an intellectual acceleration inconsistent with environmental exposure. It was a clinical way of saying something far more unsettling. The boy knew too much. When questioned about astronomy, Timothy reportedly identified constellations not visible during the current season. He corrected minor errors in an almanac owned by a visiting merchant. He spoke of tidal patterns despite living miles inland. None of these feats were impossible, yet collectively they strained probability. Knowledge requires access. Access requires opportunity. Timothy had neither. The local newspaper mentioned a curious youth of uncommon mental faculty, careful not to sensationalize. But curiosity once stirred is difficult to contain. Visitors began arriving. Educators, amateur scholars, eventually physicians from neighboring towns. The year 1867 was fertile ground for such fascination. Society was enthralled by prodigies. Phrenology, though increasingly criticized, still lingered in public imagination. The brain was seen as a frontier waiting to be mapped. If Timothy represented an unusual neurological configuration, he could become evidence of evolution in action, proof that humanity's mind was still ascending. The examinations began politely. Timothy was asked to read passages far beyond his schooling. He did so fluently. He was given arithmetic problems of increasing complexity. He solved them without visible strain. He was asked to recount events from months prior, and he did so with an almost photographic clarity that left observers exchanging uneasy glances. Yet there was something else in the accounts, something less easily measured. Several witnesses noted the boy's detachment. He did not display pride in his abilities. If anything, he seemed burdened by them. When pressed about how he knew certain things, his answers were vague. "It feels remembered," he once reportedly said, though remembered from where he could not explain. In a century obsessed with classification, ambiguity was intolerable. Scientists of the era believed firmly in environmental causation. Genius, if it appeared, could be traced to heredity or exposure. Timothy's lineage revealed no scholars. His household contained few books. No relative demonstrated similar traits. The neat frameworks of causality began to fray. By mid-1867, correspondence about the boy extended beyond his town. Letters were exchanged between physicians debating whether his abilities suggested a rare neurological structure or an undiscovered cognitive phenomenon. Some speculated hyperthymesia, though the term would not yet exist. Others wondered whether intense religious upbringing had created a psychological illusion of knowledge. A few, more quietly, admitted confusion. The tension of the era amplified the intrigue. Post-Civil War America was reconstructing not only its cities but its intellectual identity. Europe was wrestling with the implications of Darwin's theories. Humanity's origin story had shifted from divine creation to natural selection. In that climate, Timothy Caldwell's existence felt almost symbolic. Was he evidence of untapped human potential, a mutation, a prodigy shaped by unseen variables? Or was he a reminder that science, for all its progress, had limits? Accounts from neighbors reveal a growing discomfort. Children avoided him, whispering that he heard things others could not. Adults oscillated between pride and suspicion. Some believed he was touched by God. Others feared something less holy. Timothy himself reportedly began to withdraw, spending long hours alone, staring at the horizon as though listening. The physicians documented everything: pulse rates, sleep patterns, dietary habits. They measured his skull circumference, checked for asymmetry, searched for physical correlates that might anchor the mystery in flesh and bone. But nothing in his anatomy appeared abnormal. The year drew colder. By autumn, the tone of the notes shifted. Early excitement gave way to frustration. Repetition of tests yielded consistent results, yet no explanatory framework emerged. Timothy continued to demonstrate knowledge beyond his exposure. He occasionally described sensations, vibrations, distant murmurs that no one else perceived. Though such claims were recorded cautiously, they deepened the enigma. It is important to understand the psychological climate of 1867. Science was striving to replace myth. To admit uncertainty was not weakness, but it threatened momentum. If a case like Timothy's resisted explanation, it risked inviting speculation from spiritualists and mystics, eager to reclaim authority. Rational thinkers were determined not to surrender ground, and so Timothy Caldwell became more than a boy. He became a test of whether every phenomenon could be reduced to mechanism, whether every mystery was merely a puzzle awaiting the correct instrument. As winter approached, visitors grew more frequent. Timothy's home transformed into an informal laboratory. Candles burned late into the night as questions continued. Observers searched for fatigue, inconsistency, contradiction, any crack that might reveal illusion. But if Timothy faltered, the records of 1867 do not show it yet. What they do show is a mounting silence between the lines. Descriptions grow shorter, emotional commentary diminishes, the handwriting in surviving documents tightens, as though the authors feared betraying their own uncertainty. The confidence that characterized scientific discourse of the era seems, in these pages, momentarily shaken. By the close of 1867, no grand announcement had been made, no paper published an acclaim. Timothy Caldwell remained a local phenomenon, observed, debated, unresolved. Yet beneath the quiet exterior of that rural town, something profound had occurred. For all the railways, for all the telegraphs, for all the evolutionary diagrams redrawing humanity's lineage, a single boy had forced learned men to confront the possibility that explanation does not always arrive on schedule. The world of 1867 believed it was marching steadily toward clarity. But in the candlelit rooms where Timothy answered questions no one could frame properly, certainty flickered. And though history would move on toward electricity, bacteriology, and industrial triumph, the year 1867 would remain, in scattered notes and fading ink, the moment when science met a child it could observe but could not fully understand. The first signs did not arrive like lightning. They crept in quietly, disguised as coincidence, easily dismissed in isolation. A correct answer offered too quickly, a remark too precise, a question that felt less like curiosity and more like recognition. In the beginning, no one thought to record the moment Timothy Caldwell crossed the invisible boundary between gifted and inexplicable. It happened gradually, the way a shadow lengthens without announcement. He was 13 when his schoolmaster first paused mid-lesson, unsettled by the boy's interruption. The class had been reciting a passage from a borrowed geography text, a dry description of coastal formations along distant shores. Timothy raised his hand not to ask for clarification, but to correct a detail. He spoke calmly, almost apologetically, explaining that the tidal patterns described in the book were inaccurate during certain months. He referenced seasonal wind shifts and lunar cycles with language that did not belong in a rural classroom. The schoolmaster later insisted the boy must have memorized something from an unseen source, but when pressed privately, Timothy could not identify where he had learned it. "I see it when I close my eyes," he said, as though describing a memory rather than an idea. Soon after, a traveling merchant stopped in town, carrying almanacs and newspapers from larger cities. The merchant prided himself on staying informed, often engaging locals in debates about current scientific developments. On a cool afternoon in 1867, Timothy listened quietly as the man summarized a recent lecture discussing advancements in astronomical mapping. When the merchant misstated the alignment of a minor constellation, Timothy corrected him without hesitation, describing not only its position, but its neighboring stars, including one too faint to be commonly referenced in popular materials. The merchant laughed at first, then he tested the boy. Timothy answered each question with unsettling composure. Word began to circulate, not loudly, but persistently. It was not merely that he knew facts. It was the manner in which he expressed them. There was no searching for words, no visible strain of recall. He spoke as though retrieving something already organized within him. Local physician accounts described early cognitive exercises conducted informally in the Caldwell home. Timothy was given complex arithmetic sequences far beyond his schooling. He solved them without scratch paper. When presented with historical dates from foreign conflicts, he placed them in sequence and elaborated on surrounding political conditions, some of which were not mentioned in the prompt. The most disturbing element was not his accuracy, it was his anticipation. Observers noted that he often began answering before the full question was asked. At first, the assumption was accelerated learning. Some children absorb information rapidly, particularly if they possess an exceptional memory. But Timothy's household contained few books. His parents could not account for exposure to advanced material. No hidden tutor emerged. No secret correspondence was discovered. As interest grew, visiting educators attempted more structured evaluations. They dictated paragraphs from unfamiliar texts and asked Timothy to repeat them verbatim. He did so, not only immediately but days later, with no detectable error. They rearranged sentences, inserted false details to test suggestibility. Timothy identified inconsistencies without prompting. And yet, beneath the growing admiration, something darker began to surface. Timothy complained of noise, not the ordinary sounds of wind against shutters or horses along the road. He described a low vibration that seemed to hum beneath silence. At times he pressed his palms against his ears, not in panic, but in concentration, as if trying to isolate a signal. When asked what he heard, his answers were fragmented. "It's like many voices speaking at once," he once said, though he could not distinguish words. Other times he described it as distant thunder without storm. Physicians documented these claims cautiously. Auditory hallucinations were not unknown in medical literature of the period, though poorly understood. Some suspected early signs of nervous instability. Others believed the descriptions metaphorical. An imaginative boy overwhelmed by attention. But Timothy did not display the erratic behavior commonly associated with mental disturbance. He remained composed, articulate, Almost solemn, he showed no delight in his abilities. If anything, he seemed burdened by expectation. As 1867 progressed, the demonstrations intensified. A small gathering of local officials convened to witness a more formal evaluation. Timothy was presented with sealed envelopes containing written questions prepared in advance. Without opening them, he was asked to speculate on their contents. According to surviving accounts, he identified the general subject matter in several cases, though not always the precise wording. The results were ambiguous, impressive enough to provoke whispers, inconclusive enough to avoid formal declaration. It was during this period that Timothy began describing dreams. Not ordinary dreams of childhood fantasy, but vivid sequences that he claimed later unfolded in waking life. He spoke of a neighbor's barn roof collapsing days before a storm tore through the area. He described a minor carriage accident at a crossroads before it occurred. Skeptics argued these were coincidences exaggerated by memory. Yet those close to him insisted the predictions were spoken aloud beforehand. One physician attempted to disprove the phenomenon by deliberately introducing false information into Timothy's environment, hoping the boy would incorporate it into a future prediction. The effort failed. Timothy either ignored the planted detail or dismissed it outright. Observers found themselves trapped between explanations. If Timothy was fabricating, he showed no signs of manipulation. If he was delusional, his coherence contradicted typical pathology. If he was merely intelligent, the scale and nature of his knowledge exceeded accessible sources. By late summer, documentation became more meticulous. Pulse readings were taken before and after cognitive tasks. Sleep durations were recorded. Diet was monitored for stimulants. Timothy's eyes were examined for irregular movement. His skull measured in accordance with lingering phrenological practices, though many physicians privately doubted their validity. Nothing abnormal surfaced, except the knowledge itself. One particularly troubling incident involved medicinal plants. A local doctor, curious about Timothy's claims, brought several dried specimens, some common, others obscure. Timothy identified each one, describing not only their uses, but their contraindications. He warned that one herb, often applied safely in small quantities, could prove dangerous if combined with another substance recently discussed in medical journals. When questioned about how he knew this, he hesitated longer than usual. "It feels remembered," he repeated softly. The phrase began appearing frequently in the notes. It was not that he had read it, not that he had been told. It felt remembered. The scientific climate of the era struggled to accommodate such language. Memory implies prior experience. Prior experience requires event or exposure. Without those, the statement borders on the metaphysical, an unacceptable territory for physicians determined to remain grounded in reason. Yet Timothy's demeanor did not suggest mysticism. He did not claim divine inspiration. He did not attribute his knowledge to spirits or visions. If anything, he appeared confused by the attention. When asked directly whether he believed himself different, he reportedly answered, "I only answer what seems already there." As autumn approached, the emotional cost became more visible. Timothy's appetite declined. Dark circles formed beneath his eyes. The constant examinations drained him. Though still capable of extraordinary recall, he began speaking more slowly, as if navigating increasing internal pressure. Witnesses describe moments when he would pause mid-sentence, gaze unfocused, listening to something imperceptible to others. When gently prompted, he resumed without embarrassment, as though interruption were natural. Skepticism intensified alongside fascination. Some townspeople accused the family of encouraging spectacle for attention. Others feared the boy's abilities bordered on the unnatural. Children avoided him, whispering that he could hear thoughts. Timothy responded not with anger, but with withdrawal. He spent long hours alone outdoors, staring toward the horizon at dusk. When asked what he saw, he answered, "Patterns." He could not elaborate further. The physicians, increasingly divided, debated privately whether continued testing was beneficial. Some argued that extraordinary ability demanded documentation before it vanished. Others worried that the scrutiny itself might be causing harm. In the margins of one surviving letter, a researcher scribbled a question that would never receive resolution. Is the phenomenon intrinsic, or is it responsive to inquiry? It was a subtle admission of uncertainty. Could the act of observation alter the manifestation? As 1867 neared its end, Timothy's predictions grew less frequent. He still demonstrated unusual memory and comprehension, but the effortless clarity of early months seemed to dim. Whether from fatigue, stress, or something less tangible, no one could determine. And beneath all the data, the pulse counts, the written transcripts, the sealed envelopes, lingered a deeper discomfort. Timothy Caldwell did not behave like a fraud, nor like a prodigy basking in recognition. He behaved like a boy carrying information too heavy for his frame. In an era convinced that knowledge flowed through study and inheritance, he represented an unsolved equation. A mind that appeared to reach beyond its environment. A memory that seemed to extend beyond experience. Science in 1867 possessed instruments for measurement, but not yet language for this. And so the first signs, the corrections in class, the constellations recited, the herbs identified, the dreams spoken quietly before they unfolded, became more than curiosities. They became evidence of a boundary not yet mapped. Timothy Caldwell stood at that boundary, not triumphant, not defiant, but quietly overwhelmed. A boy answering questions no one fully understood how to ask. By late autumn of 1867, curiosity had hardened into procedure. What began as cautious observation evolved into deliberate experimentation. The tone shifted. No longer content to witness Timothy Caldwell's abilities in informal settings, the physicians and visiting scholars sought structure, control, repetition. If the phenomenon was real, it would endure scrutiny. If it faltered under pressure, then perhaps it had been illusion all along. The Caldwell home gradually transformed into something colder than a residence. Heavy curtains were drawn to limit distraction. A small side room was cleared of furniture and repurposed as a testing chamber. A single wooden table, 2 straight-back chairs, oil lamps positioned carefully to eliminate shadow. The environment was designed to reduce variables. Light, temperature, sound, all were monitored as best as 19th century conditions allowed. Timothy did not protest. That detail appears repeatedly in personal notes. He did not resist the examinations. He did not display indignation or fear. He simply complied, sitting quietly as papers were arranged before him, as physicians exchanged hushed strategies. The first phase focused on repetition. Questions he had previously answered with ease were posed again days later. Astronomical configurations, mathematical sequences, historical chronologies. At first the results were consistent. His recall remained precise. He corrected minor intentional errors inserted into prompts. He identified inconsistencies and altered passages. But the sessions lengthened. What had once been brief demonstrations now extended for hours. Timothy was instructed to remain seated while observers rotated shifts. Sleep schedules were altered. He was occasionally woken in the middle of the night and presented with problems to solve, the intention being to determine whether his abilities were dependent on full alertness. The results unsettled them. Even when roused abruptly from sleep, Timothy answered complex questions with alarming coherence. In one recorded session, he completed a sequence of mental calculations in near darkness, illuminated only by a single oil lamp burning low. A physician noted that his pupils appeared dilated beyond expectation, though whether from fatigue or something else could not be determined. Frustration began to seep into the process. They introduced isolation. For 2 consecutive days, Timothy was separated from family and external conversation, allowed only minimal interaction for essential needs. The aim was to eliminate the possibility of environmental cues influencing his responses. When testing resumed, his knowledge did not diminish. But something else did. Observers began noting physical changes. His hands trembled slightly when resting. His voice, once steady and measured, occasionally faltered at the edges of sentences. He answered correctly, but more slowly. After extended sessions, he pressed his fingers to his temples as though containing pressure behind his eyes. A visiting scholar suggested sensory deprivation as a further variable. Curtains were sealed tighter. Noise was reduced to near silence. Timothy was asked to sit in stillness before being presented with tasks. It was during these moments that he began describing the vibration more frequently. "It is louder when everything else is quiet," he reportedly whispered. Physicians exchanged looks, but did not record emotional reaction. They documented the statement clinically. Subject reports intensified internal auditory perception during reduced external stimulus. The experiments grew more aggressive. One evening, Timothy was presented with a sealed wooden box containing unknown contents. He was told nothing of its origin. He was asked to describe what lay inside. After several minutes of silence, he described metallic objects, elongated with ridged edges. When opened, the box revealed a set of specialized surgical instruments, borrowed from a distant clinic. Though not perfectly detailed, his general description was disturbingly close. Skeptics argued educated guesswork. Perhaps the box shape suggested weight distribution. Perhaps subtle sounds had betrayed clues. Yet no one could conclusively identify how he arrived at his answer. And still, they pressed. Sleep deprivation extended to longer intervals. Timothy's nights shortened, his days filled with structured questioning. Meals were scheduled between sessions. Notes multiplied, filling page after page with observations of pulse rate fluctuations and pupil response. Then, gradually, something shifted. Where once his responses flowed effortlessly, they began to fragment. During one test, he paused midway through a mathematical solution and stared at the table surface for nearly a minute before completing the equation. On another occasion, he misidentified a constellation he had previously recited flawlessly. The room grew tense. Was this proof of fraud unraveling, or evidence of exhaustion? Rather than ease the intensity, some physicians interpreted the faltering as a sign they were close to breakthrough. Pressure might reveal the mechanism. Under strain, the source of his knowledge might expose itself. They increased repetition frequency. Timothy's complexion paled, dark circles deepened beneath his eyes. When asked how he felt, he often responded with a single word: tired. One researcher privately recorded a concern that prolonged cognitive demand might be inducing nervous collapse. The term neurasthenia would later gain prominence, but at the time, they lacked precise diagnostic language. They recognized deterioration, but not its cause. The most controversial session occurred in early winter. Timothy was placed in a dimly lit room alone with a notebook and instructed to document any spontaneous thoughts or impressions that surfaced over several hours. Observers monitored from an adjacent space, ensuring he received no external input. When the notebook was retrieved, its pages were filled with fragmented phrases, astronomical coordinates, botanical classifications, disconnected historical dates. Others trailed off mid-sentence. One line, underlined twice, read, "It fades when I am watched too closely." The statement circulated quietly among the physicians. The possibility emerged, unspoken at first, that the phenomenon might be reactive, that scrutiny itself altered its manifestation. In other fields of inquiry, observation was assumed neutral. Here, neutrality seemed questionable, yet admitting that possibility threatened the foundation of their approach. Scientific methodology depended on repeatability under observation. If Timothy's abilities diminished when examined, how could they ever confirm them objectively? In private correspondence, one physician wrote that the boy seemed less a subject and more a mirror, reflecting our demand back upon itself. Meanwhile, Timothy's condition worsened. He began complaining of headaches that persisted through the night. His once fluid speech became halting during prolonged sessions. At times, he closed his eyes before answering, as though retrieving something from greater distance. Then came the silence. During one scheduled examination, he failed to respond at all. A complex arithmetic problem was placed before him. He stared at it without expression. Minutes passed. When prompted gently, he shook his head and whispered, "It's too loud." The room fell still. No one else heard anything. Testing was suspended for the evening, but resumed the following day with modified parameters. Shorter sessions, simplified questions, Yet the brilliance that had characterized earlier months flickered unpredictably. Some responses remained sharp, others dissolved into uncertainty. Whispers began circulating that perhaps the phenomenon had never been stable, that early excitement had exaggerated ordinary giftedness. But those who had witnessed the initial demonstrations knew better. Something had changed. The act of relentless inquiry had taken its toll. One physician, more reflective than the rest, drafted a letter that was never formally published. In it, he questioned whether their approach had been misguided from the start. If this faculty, he wrote, is delicate in nature, perhaps it requires trust rather than interrogation. The letter remained private. Publicly, documentation continued, though with diminishing enthusiasm. Fewer visitors arrived. The novelty had waned. Results no longer astonished. They confused. By late winter, sessions were sporadic. Timothy's health was visibly fragile. He moved more slowly, spoke less frequently. When asked to describe the vibrations he once reported, he simply answered, "They are fading." Whether this was relief or loss, no one could tell. Then, almost as abruptly as the experiments had begun, the records thinned. No comprehensive study presented to academic circles. The thick notebooks filled with measurements and transcripts were archived quietly. Some never catalogued properly. A case that had once stirred intellectual urgency dissolved into ambiguity. In the years that followed, advancements in electricity and bacteriology captured scientific attention. New discoveries overshadowed old uncertainties. Timothy Caldwell's name receded into footnotes, then into obscurity. What remains in the scattered documents of 1867 is not proof of supernatural ability, nor confirmation of fraud. It is something subtler and more unsettling. It is the image of a boy subjected to the full weight of a century's hunger for explanation. A mind examined under oil lamps until its light dimmed. A possibility pressed so relentlessly for answers that it may have withdrawn entirely. The experiments no one talks about are not remarkable for their cruelty by the standards of the era. They were methodical, even restrained compared to other historical inquiries. Yet they reveal something profound about the limits of observation. In their determination to understand Timothy Caldwell, they may have altered the very thing they sought to measure. And when the phenomenon weakened under scrutiny, they did not celebrate discovery. They recorded silence. By 1869, the name Timothy Caldwell no longer traveled beyond the edges of his town. The visitors had stopped coming. The oil lamps no longer burned late into the night over scattered notes and measured observations. The side room that had briefly functioned as a testing chamber returned to its original purpose, its walls absorbing the memory of whispered debates and restless calculations. If there had ever been an expectation of publication, of formal recognition, of a paper presented before an academic society, it dissolved without announcement. What remained was absence. In the years immediately following the experiments, documentation thinned to almost nothing. A few scattered medical notes reference persistent fatigue and decline of unusual faculties. One unsigned letter, preserved in a private collection decades later, mentions that the boy no longer demonstrates the accelerated cognition previously observed. The tone is clinical, restrained, almost embarrassed. There was no declaration that the case had been solved. There was no admission that it had not. Some accounts suggest Timothy's health deteriorated rapidly after the winter of intensive examination. Descriptions of nervous exhaustion appear repeatedly in marginalia, a phrase commonly used in the 19th century to describe conditions poorly understood. It could mean anxiety, collapse, weakness, or simply an inability to meet expectation. It carried no precise diagnosis, only implication. Neighbors recalled seeing him less frequently outdoors. The boy who once corrected textbooks and recited constellations now moved quietly between home and brief errands. His gaze, once described as piercing, seemed distant. Whether from illness, shame, or relief, no one could agree. One rumor claimed he was sent away to an institution in a neighboring county, not for madness, but for rest. Such institutions were often ambiguous places, part sanctuary, part confinement. Records from that period are incomplete, and no official registry bearing his name has been definitively linked to him. Another account suggests he remained at home until a sudden fever carried him off before his 18th year. There is no marked grave widely recognized as his. If he was buried locally, the stone has not survived intact. What is certain is that his disappearance from scientific conversation was swift. By the early 1870s, the world had shifted its attention elsewhere. Advances in electrical experimentation began to dominate intellectual circles. The foundations of germ theory gained traction, promising to explain diseases that had long been attributed to miasma and superstition. Laboratories expanded. Funding followed practical breakthroughs. The appetite for phenomena that resisted classification diminished. In such a climate, Timothy Caldwell became inconvenient. He had offered no replicable formula, no apparatus to construct, no method to refine. His case did not lead to invention, it did not generate industry, it produced questions, and questions without immediate utility often struggle to survive. There is something telling in the silence that followed. Scientists are not unfamiliar with failure. Experiments collapse, hypotheses dissolve. Yet those failures are typically documented, analyzed, archived with clarity. In Timothy's case, the silence feels deliberate. Not overtly conspiratorial, but subtly protective. To acknowledge that a boy once demonstrated abilities beyond available explanation would have required either a radical expansion of theoretical frameworks or an admission of methodological limitation. Both were uncomfortable propositions in an era fueled by confidence. One private correspondence from a physician involved in the early examinations contains a line that resonates decades later. We must be cautious not to dignify anomalies that cannot be preserved. The sentence is restrained yet revealing. If a phenomenon could not be stabilized, measured repeatedly, and controlled, perhaps it was safer to let it fade. And so it did. By the end of the decade, younger physicians entering practice had never heard the name. The notebooks, once handled with urgency, gathered dust in cabinets. Some were lost to damp storage. Others were misplaced during estate transfers when the original observers died. A few pages survived only because they were tucked into unrelated volumes. History is not merely what is recorded. It is what is chosen. Timothy Caldwell's story was not dramatic enough to demand preservation, nor trivial enough to be mocked openly. It occupied a fragile middle ground, unsettling, unresolved, unproductive. In townspeople's memory, he became a story told quietly, almost apologetically. There was once a boy, they would begin, then trail off. Without documentation to anchor the narrative, details blurred. The predictions grew exaggerated in some retellings, minimized in others. Over time, he transformed from subject to rumor. Yet beneath the erosion of specifics, something lingered, a discomfort. Those who had witnessed his early demonstrations could not entirely dismiss them. They had seen the calculations performed without error. They had heard the precise astronomical descriptions. They had watched sealed envelopes open to reveal subjects he had anticipated. Memory, even when unrecorded, resists complete erasure. But memory alone is fragile against the machinery of progress. The late 19th century marched forward with extraordinary momentum. Industrial expansion demanded practical innovation. Universities prioritized research with tangible outcomes. The age of electricity dazzled public imagination, far more than a quiet boy whose abilities had dimmed under scrutiny. And perhaps that was the most unsettling aspect of all. Timothy's brilliance did not explode into scandal. It did not end in spectacle. It simply weakened. The idea that observation might have altered the phenomenon was never formally explored. To do so would have required questioning the neutrality of scientific inquiry itself. If scrutiny could extinguish what it sought to understand, then certainty was more fragile than assumed. Better perhaps to let the case recede. There are historians who argue that the late 1800s were marked by selective attention, that narratives reinforcing progress were amplified, while anomalies were softened or ignored. Timothy Caldwell fits that pattern uncomfortably well. He offered no technological breakthrough, no patent, no treatise, only a fleeting suggestion that human cognition might extend beyond known parameters. Without continuation, suggestion becomes speculation. Speculation becomes inconvenience, and inconvenience fades. What might have happened had his case emerged a century later? In an era equipped with neuroimaging and standardized psychological assessment, would modern tools have revealed hyperthymesia, savant syndrome, or some rare neurological configuration? Or would they too have confronted limits? We cannot know. What we do know is that his final months were marked not by acclaim but by quiet retreat. The boy who once sat beneath lamplight answering impossible questions likely ended his days far from intellectual debate. Whether he felt relief at the fading of expectation, or grief at the loss of whatever faculty had once illuminated his mind, remains unrecorded. There is a peculiar cruelty in being extraordinary only briefly. To awaken curiosity across a community, to challenge the confidence of educated men, and then to dim before understanding arrives, it leaves no satisfying conclusion, no triumph, no cautionary tale neatly resolved, only ambiguity. Perhaps that is why his story was buried so easily. Progress prefers clarity. It celebrates discovery, tolerates error, but struggles with sustained uncertainty. Timothy Caldwell represented sustained uncertainty. He forced rational thinkers to confront the possibility that not all phenomena submit to immediate explanation. And rather than expand their frameworks, they chose patience. The patience of forgetting. Today his name surfaces only in scattered archival references and reconstructed accounts pieced together from fading ink. There is no monument, no formal recognition, no preserved laboratory bearing his legacy. Yet his absence speaks. It reminds us that the history of science is not solely a record of triumphs, but of mysteries set aside. For every celebrated breakthrough, there are questions deferred. For every published theory, there are anomalies, folded quietly into obscurity. Timothy Caldwell became one of those folded pages, not disproven, not validated, simply closed, and in that closure lies the darker resonance of his